The Rothschilds controlled European banking. But there was another Jewish family you've never heard of that made the Rothschilds look poor. At their peak, the Sassoons controlled 70% of all opium flowing into China. 70%. They didn't just influence Shanghai's economy, they owned it. The docks, the mills, the banks, the real estate, everything. Here's what nobody tells you about the British Empire's conquest of China. It wasn't led by the British government. It was orchestrated by one family of Iraqi Jewish refugees who turned opium addiction into the largest fortune in Asian history. They addicted an entire nation, made billions, built an empire that stretched from Bombay to London. And when it all collapsed, they walked away with their wealth intact while millions died. The British called them the Rothschilds of the East. The Chinese called them something else entirely: drug lords, colonial parasites, the architects of China's century of humiliation. But what nobody knows is how they did it. How a family fleeing persecution in Baghdad became more powerful than the British East India Company. How they manipulated two empires, started wars, and built Shanghai into the Paris of the East, all on the backs of opium addicts. This is the story of the Sassoons, and I'm warning you now, it's not pretty. Chapter 1, Baghdad Exodus. David Sassoon wasn't supposed to be a refugee. Born in 1792 in Baghdad, he grew up in one of the city's most prominent Jewish families. His father, Saleh Sassoon, served as the chief treasurer to the pashas who governed Baghdad under Ottoman rule. The family lived in a massive courtyard house in the Jewish quarter. They wore fine silks. They read Hebrew and Arabic fluently. They were, by every measure, Baghdad's Jewish elite. The Sassoon name meant something. Sheikh Sassoon, as David's father was known, didn't just manage finances. He arbitrated disputes, represented the Jewish community to Muslim authorities, and controlled access to Ottoman patronage. When you needed something done in Baghdad, you went through the Sassoons. David absorbed this world completely. By his 20s, he spoke 5 languages: Hebrew, Arabic, Persian, English, and Hindustani. He understood accounting, trading networks, and most importantly, how to navigate between cultures. Skills that seemed ordinary in cosmopolitan Baghdad would become priceless in the chaos that followed. Everything shattered in 1828. Dawood Pasha, the Ottoman governor, turned paranoid. He saw conspiracies everywhere, started confiscating property, executing perceived enemies. The Sassoons, with their wealth and connections, became targets. Sheikh Sassoon died. Some sources say from stress, others whisper about poison. David, now the family leader at 36, faced an impossible choice: stay and risk everything, or run. He ran, first to Bushehr on the Persian Gulf in 1828. But Persia offered no real opportunities for a Jewish merchant without connections, so in 1832 he moved again, to Bombay, the crown jewel of British India. You need to understand what Bombay looked like in 1832. This wasn't the cosmopolitan metropolis it would become. The British had only controlled it for 170 years. David arrived with his wife, 8 children, and whatever portable wealth he'd managed to smuggle out of Baghdad. He rented space in the Bombay fort area, where most foreign merchants operated. And then he did something brilliant. He refused to anglicize. While other immigrant merchants adopted British names, British dress, British customs, David kept his Arabic name, kept wearing traditional robes, kept his son studying Hebrew. The Sassoon household remained orthodox, strictly kosher, Shabbat observant, Hebrew-speaking. This wasn't just cultural pride, this was strategy. You see, Bombay's economy ran on networks, Parsi networks, Gujarati networks, British networks. Each community controlled different trades through bonds of trust and shared language. David couldn't break into British networks. He was too foreign. He couldn't penetrate Parsi networks. He wasn't born into them. But he could create his own network, a Jewish trading house that connected Baghdad, Calcutta, Bombay, and eventually Canton. His first moves were cautious. He traded cotton, shipped textiles, nothing dramatic. But he was watching, learning, building relationships with other Baghdadi Jewish merchants who'd also fled to India, creating a community of trust in a city where trust was currency. The breakthrough came when he noticed something the British desperately wanted but couldn't easily access: opium distribution networks. The East India Company controlled opium production in Bengal. They grew it, processed it. But selling it in China, that required different skills, required merchants who could operate in Canton, navigate Chinese compradors, deal in multiple currencies, and crucially, operate outside official British channels because China had banned opium. David had those skills. His sons spoke multiple languages. His Baghdad connections gave him credibility with Middle Eastern traders operating in Asian ports. And his outsider status, not British, not Chinese, not beholden to the East India Company, made him perfect for the shadow economy of contraband. In 1832, David Sassoon and Sons officially opened for business. The firm's letterhead was in Hebrew. The business language was Arabic. But the commodity that would make them billions was opium, grown in India, shipped to China, sold to addicts. By 1837, just 5 years after arriving in Bombay, David had established a permanent agent in Canton. His son Elias Sassoon managed the Chinese operations. The family business was no longer about textiles or general trade. It was about opium, specifically about becoming the middleman between British production and Chinese addiction. The numbers started small, a few chests here and there. But David understood something crucial. The British would go to war to keep this trade flowing. The Chinese emperor had banned opium, confiscated foreign stocks, and executed dealers. Most merchants would have seen this as a crisis. David saw it as an opportunity. When the First Opium War erupted in 1839, David Sassoon and Sons was perfectly positioned. While British traders fled Canton, the Sassoons maintained their networks. While other firms collapsed, the Sassoons bought their contacts, their roots, their Chinese partnerships. By 1842, when Britain forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanking, the Sassoon network stretched from Bombay to Hong Kong. They had offices in Calcutta, warehouses in Canton, agents in Singapore. And with the new treaty ports opening, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Xiamen, David had a decision to make. He could stay in the established Canton trade, or he could gamble on Shanghai, a city that barely existed, a port that was literally just mudflats and fishing villages. David Sassoon made his choice. He sent his second son, Elias, north to Shanghai with clear instructions: establish dominance before anyone else realizes what this city will become. But this wasn't the end of the Sassoon story. This was just the foundation. Because what they built in Shanghai over the next 50 years would make their Bombay fortune look like pocket change. Chapter 2. Bombay Rising. Between 1843 and 1858, David Sassoon transformed from refugee merchant to the undisputed king of the India-China opium trade. These 15 years were the foundation, the period when the Sassoon trading empire went from small-time operation to monopolistic powerhouse. The genius was in the vertical integration. David didn't just trade opium. He controlled the entire supply chain. Start with production. David established relationships with opium growers in Patna and Benares, the two regions where the British East India Company grew its finest opium. While other traders bought at auction in Calcutta, the Sassoons negotiated advance contracts. They paid growers before harvest, locked in prices, guaranteed supply. When opium prices spiked, which happened constantly as demand in China exploded, the Sassoons had inventory at pre-spike costs while competitors scrambled. Then, shipping. David invested in his own fleet, owned the vessels outright. This wasn't about saving shipping costs, though that helped. This was about control. When you control the ships, you control timing. You control routing. You decide whether to flood the market or restrict supply. The Sassoon fleet grew to 23 vessels by 1850, each one flying the company flag, a Star of David in blue. Next, distribution networks. This is where David's sons became crucial. He had 8 sons, and each one managed a different node in the empire. Elias ran Shanghai operations. Abdullah handled Bombay and Calcutta. Sassoon David, yes, literally named Sassoon, managed Hong Kong. Solomon oversaw Canton before it declined. The company wasn't just a business, it was a family network where blood ties replaced legal contracts. Here's what's interesting. The Sassoons operated in a legal gray zone that was somehow both illegal and protected. Opium was banned in China, completely illegal. The Chinese emperor had made it a capital offense, but the British Navy actively protected the opium trade. British gunboats patrolled Chinese waters specifically to ensure opium ships could operate, so David was breaking Chinese law with British military protection. The contradiction was the point. The British government officially opposed the opium trade, claimed it was a private enterprise, nothing to do with Her Majesty's government. But when Chinese authorities seized opium or arrested dealers, British warships responded with bombardment. David understood this hypocrisy perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. By 1850, David Sassoon and Sons was moving approximately 4,000 chests of opium per year into China. Each chest weighed about 140 pounds. That's 560,000 pounds of opium annually. The profit margin? Roughly 400%. You bought opium in India for $300 per chest. You sold it in Shanghai for $200 per chest. Sometimes more if supply tightened. Do the math. 4,000 chests at $900 profit per chest equals 3.6 million in annual profits. In 1850 dollars, that's equivalent to roughly $120 million annually in today's money, from one commodity, from one family business. But the Sassoons weren't satisfied with opium alone. They were building something bigger, a trading empire that used opium profits to finance legitimate businesses. Cotton mills in Bombay, real estate in Hong Kong, banking operations, shipping beyond just opium routes. The cotton business was particularly clever. The Sassoons bought raw cotton from Indian growers, shipped it to Manchester on their own vessels, then imported finished textiles back to India and China for sale. They controlled both ends of the supply chain, made money on the raw export, made money on the finished import, and used the same ships that carried opium to carry cotton on return voyages. What most people miss is how David cultivated British support. He donated generously to British causes in India, funded schools, built synagogues that British officials attended, made himself indispensable to British governors who needed local knowledge and local networks. In 1853, David did something extraordinary. He funded the construction of the Masjid Bunda Railroad in Bombay, India's first passenger railway. Cost him a fortune, but it bought him something more valuable than money: legitimacy. The British press praised him as a civilizing force, a merchant prince bringing modernity to India, conveniently ignoring that his fortune came from addicting millions of Chinese. The truth was darker. Between 1840 and 1858, opium imports to China increased by 400%. The number of addicts grew from roughly 2 million to over 10 million. Entire regions of China saw their economies collapse as workers chose opium over food. Silver drained from China to pay for the drug. The Qing dynasty weakened, and fortunes like the Sassoons grew exponentially. David kept meticulous records. The family archives, now scattered between London and Mumbai, show he understood exactly what he was doing. Letters to his sons discuss market cultivation, which meant creating new addicts. Talk about suppressing local competition, which meant collaborating with British authorities to eliminate Chinese dealers who didn't buy from the Sassoons. One letter from 1851 is particularly chilling. David writes to Elias in Shanghai, "The recent enforcement action by British patrol has cleared the market of irregular suppliers. Our prices have risen 23% as predicted. Recommend maintaining current volume until local production attempts are suppressed." Translation: the British Navy had just destroyed Chinese opium dealers, creating a supply shortage that let the Sassoons raise prices and increase profits. By 1858, David Sassoon was the richest man in Bombay. His mansion, Sans Souci, overlooked the harbour. British governors attended his dinners. His sons married into other prominent Baghdadi Jewish families, creating an interconnected merchant aristocracy. And the Sassoon trading empire controlled an estimated 70% of the opium trade between India and China. 70%. Think about that. One family, one commodity, near total market dominance. But David knew something crucial. Empires built on single commodities are fragile. Opium had made them rich. But Shanghai was about to make them invincible. When David died in 1864 at age 72, he left an empire worth approximately $500,000, roughly $75 million in today's money. His sons divided the business. Abdullah took Bombay operations, Elias took Shanghai. And it was Elias, quiet and methodical, who would transform Shanghai from a treaty port into the Sassoon family's greatest achievement. Because Shanghai wasn't just another trading post, Shanghai was the future, and the Sassoons were about to own it. Chapter 3. Shanghai Arrival. Shanghai in 1845 wasn't a city, it was mud, literally. The Bund, that famous waterfront that would become Asia's most valuable real estate, was a riverbank covered in reeds, where Chinese fishermen pulled boats onto the shore. The total foreign population was maybe 50 people. There were no buildings, no infrastructure, no government beyond a confused Chinese magistrate who didn't understand why the British treaty suddenly gave foreigners the right to live there. Elias Sassoon arrived in this chaos and saw opportunity. Look, you need to understand the Treaty of Nanking's implications. When Britain defeated China in the First Opium War, they didn't just want Hong Kong. They wanted treaty ports, cities where foreigners could live, trade, and operate under their own laws. Shanghai was one of 5, but unlike Canton, which had centuries of trading tradition, Shanghai was new, undefined, up for grabs. The British established the Shanghai International Settlement, north of the old Chinese city, literally drew lines on a map and declared, "This is foreign territory. Chinese law doesn't apply. You report to a consular government run by foreigners." And in this legal vacuum, the Sassoons built their empire. Elias arrived with capital, connections, and a clear mandate from David. Establish a permanent Sassoon presence before competitors understand Shanghai's potential. His first office was a wooden shack on the Bund. 4 rooms, dirt floor. But the location was perfect, right at the intersection of where the Huangpu River met the Yangtze, the main artery into China's interior. The initial business was pure opium. Ships from Bombay would arrive carrying chests of Patna and Benares opium. Elias would store them in Sassoon warehouses, then distribute to Chinese compradors, middlemen who handled the actual sale to addicts and dens. The Sassoons never directly sold to Chinese consumers. Too risky, too visible. Instead, they supplied the network, controlled the flow, owned the infrastructure. By 1850, Elias had established multiple opium warehouses along the Huangpu River, built a proper office building on the Bund, stone construction, 2 stories, prominently displaying the Sassoon name in English, Hebrew, and Chinese. Employed a staff of 30 people, mostly Parsis and Baghdadi Jews brought from India. What's interesting is how the Sassoons positioned themselves socially. They weren't just merchants, they were community builders. Elias donated funds for Shanghai's first synagogue in 1850, hosted dinners for British consular officials, married Sarah Heim, daughter of another prominent Baghdadi Jewish merchant, creating family alliances that strengthened trading networks. But the real transformation came after 1853. That year, a massive rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, erupted in China. Rebels captured Nanjing, threatened Shanghai. Millions died. The Qing dynasty tottered on the brink of collapse, and in the chaos, the Sassoons made their most important decision. They stopped being just opium traders and became real estate developers. Here's the thing, war is terrifying for most people. For the Sassoons, it was a buying opportunity. As Chinese fled Shanghai's old city, and wealthy Chinese merchants desperately needed safe haven, the international settlement offered protection. Foreign gunboats patrolled the waterfront. Foreign troops guarded the settlement borders. If you had money and wanted safety, you moved to the foreign concessions. Elias started buying land. Lots of it. Entire city blocks for prices that seem absurd now, a few $100s per acre. But this was swampland, undeveloped mud that needed extensive drainage and construction. Most merchants thought he was crazy. Why invest in construction when you could flip opium for 400% margins? Because Elias understood something they didn't. Shanghai was about to explode. The treaty ports weren't temporary arrangements, they were permanent. The British weren't leaving. And as China modernized or was forced to modernize, Shanghai would become the gateway, the place where East met West, where Chinese merchants did business with foreigners, where capital flowed. By 1860, the Sassoon real estate portfolio in Shanghai was worth more than their opium inventory. They owned warehouses, office buildings, residential properties. They leased to other foreign trading houses. They became essentially Shanghai's landlords. But they didn't abandon opium, not even close. Between 1858 and 1880, opium imports to China increased from roughly 4,000 tons annually to over 6,500 tons. The Sassoons controlled the majority. Their ships, now numbering over 30 vessels, shuttled constantly between India and China. The profits were astronomical. One contemporary account from 1865 describes a single Sassoon opium auction in Shanghai. The crowd gathered early. Compradors and dealers packed into the Sassoon go-down. Elias Sassoon presided personally, his voice steady, as he auctioned 500 chests in 3 hours. The total sale exceeded 600,000 tiles of silver, roughly $800,000 in American currency. Think about that. $500,000 in profit from a single auction. In 1865, that's roughly $9 million in today's money, from 3 hours of selling opium. The moral questions were obvious. Chinese officials repeatedly protested. Chinese scholars wrote treatises on how opium was destroying their country. The emperor issued edicts, useless, unenforceable edicts, banning the trade. But the Sassoons had British military protection. As long as Britain wanted the opium trade to continue, it would continue. Elias handled these contradictions by simply refusing to acknowledge them. In public, he spoke about bringing commerce and civilization to China, about building infrastructure, about his charitable work funding hospitals and schools. The opium? That was never mentioned in polite company. What nobody knew was how the family was positioning for the next phase. Elias's nephew, Albert Abdullah David Sassoon, known as Abdullah, had returned from Oxford educated, anglicized, and ambitious. Unlike his father and uncles, Abdullah was completely British in mannerism and outlook. He wore British suits, spoke English primarily, married a British woman, and he saw that the future of the Sassoon fortune wasn't just opium, it was legitimacy. Abdullah began pushing the family to diversify, invest in cotton mills, banking, shipping legitimate cargo, use the opium profits to build respectable businesses that could outlast the drug trade. This created tension. The older generation, David's sons, had built everything on opium. They understood it, trusted it, knew how to manipulate that market. Diversification meant risk, meant learning new industries. But by 1867, when David Sassoon died, the writing was on the wall. China was slowly getting stronger. The Qing dynasty was implementing reforms, building its own military. Eventually, maybe not soon, but eventually, they would have the power to actually enforce opium bans. The British might not always be willing to fight wars over drug trafficking. The family split. Some members wanted to maximize opium profits while they could. Others wanted to transition to legitimate businesses. The compromise was both. Keep the opium flowing, but invest the profits in mills, real estate, and banking. By 1870, the Sassoons owned 12 cotton mills in India, employed over 20,000 workers, and were Shanghai's largest property owners. The opium trade continued, but it was no longer their only business. They were becoming slowly a diversified trading empire. And Shanghai was becoming the Paris of the East. The Bund was transforming from mudflats to stone buildings, electric lights, hotels, banks. The Sassoons owned much of it, and they were just getting started. Chapter 4. Opium Empire. Between 1870 and 1895, the Sassoon family reached the absolute peak of their opium dominance. These 25 years represent the most profitable, most powerful, and most morally indefensible period of the family empire. The numbers are staggering. By 1880, China was importing approximately 6,500 tons of opium annually. The Sassoons controlled an estimated 70% of this trade. That's 4,550 tons of opium, moving through Sassoon warehouses, Sassoon ships, Sassoon distribution networks every single year. Let me put this in perspective. Each ton of opium could supply roughly 15,000 addicts for a year. So the Sassoons were supplying, directly or indirectly, opium for approximately 68 million addict years annually. China's population was about 400 million. That means the Sassoons were actively involved in maintaining addiction for roughly 15% of China's entire population. 15%. One family, one drug, millions of ruined lives. The operation was sophisticated. The Sassoons didn't just ship raw opium and hope for sales. They had developed an entire ecosystem. First, production control. By the 1870s, the Sassoons had representatives embedded directly with opium growers in Patna and Benares. They provided financing, seeds, equipment. In exchange, growers were locked into exclusive selling agreements. The Sassoons bought their entire harvest. This meant they could regulate supply, restrict it when they wanted to push prices up, flood the market when they wanted to destroy competitors. Second, quality standardization. The Sassoons created a grading system for opium. First-grade Patna became the premium product, high morphine content, consistent quality, packaged in distinctive Sassoon chests with the family seal. Chinese compradors knew Sassoon opium was reliable. This branding mattered enormously in a market filled with adulterated product. Third, financial infrastructure. The Sassoons established banking operations that financed the entire opium pipeline. They gave credit to Chinese compradors, accepted payment in multiple currencies, hedged exchange rate risks. They weren't just selling drugs, they were operating a full-service financial system built around narcotics. Fourth, political protection. This is where it gets really dark. The Sassoons maintained extremely close relationships with British officials. They hosted governors, donated to British causes, and in exchange, British gunboats made sure Sassoon opium shipments were never disrupted. One incident from 1875 shows how this worked. A reformist Chinese official in Jiangsu province began aggressively enforcing opium bans. He arrested Chinese dealers who sold Sassoon product, seized Sassoon warehouses. The British consul in Shanghai filed a formal protest. When the Chinese official refused to back down, British warships appeared off the coast. The official was removed, the warehouses were returned, business resumed. The Sassoons didn't even have to request intervention. The British government did it automatically because the opium trade generated so much customs revenue that funding British colonial administration depended on it. Here's what's twisted. While poisoning millions with opium, the Sassoons were simultaneously celebrated as philanthropists and civilizers. In 1872, Abdullah Sassoon was knighted by Queen Victoria. The newspapers praised his contributions to Anglo-Indian commerce. The opium trade, barely mentioned. Instead, the coverage focused on his donations to hospitals, schools, libraries. The Sassoon family cultivated this dual image meticulously. They built the Sassoon dock in Bombay, a massive infrastructure project that employed thousands. They funded the David Sassoon Library and Reading Room, still standing in Mumbai today. They donated to Jewish charities across the British Empire. Every act of philanthropy was public, celebrated, immortalized in marble plaques bearing the Sassoon name. The opium? That happened quietly, in warehouses, on ships, in the account books that only family members saw. By 1885, the Sassoon business empire was worth an estimated $2.5 million, approximately $375 million in today's money. But the real wealth was in assets, the ships, the warehouses, the mills, the real estate. Shanghai properties alone were worth millions, and they were appreciating rapidly as the city grew. Shanghai's population had exploded from 50,000 in 1845 to over 600,000 by 1890. The international settlement was booming. Western businesses were flooding in, banks, trading houses, insurance companies, and they all needed property. The Sassoons owned it, leased it, controlled it. The family was also evolving. The third generation, David's grandchildren, were now running operations. Edward Sassoon had taken over the Indian businesses. Jacob Sassoon managed banking. And Victor Sassoon, born in 1881, was being groomed to take over Shanghai operations. What's interesting is how the family maintained unity. Most family businesses fragment by the third generation. The Sassoons had a system. Everything was owned by David Sassoon and Sons, the original partnership. Profits were distributed according to complicated formulas based on seniority and contribution. Nobody could sell their share without family approval. It was a private empire, accountable to nobody outside the family. But cracks were appearing. China was changing. The Qing dynasty, humiliated by defeats in the Opium Wars, was attempting modernization, building railroads, telegraph lines, modern armies, and increasingly, Chinese officials were arguing that opium was a national security threat that had to be stopped. In 1890, Chinese domestic opium production had started competing with imports. Chinese farmers in Yunnan and Sichuan provinces were growing their own opium. Lower quality, but much cheaper, and without import tariffs. The Sassoon market share was still dominant, but for the first time it was being challenged not by foreign competitors, but by Chinese production. The Sassoons' response was to double down on Shanghai real estate. Between 1890 and 1900, they invested millions in construction projects, office buildings, hotels, apartment blocks. The Sassoon house on the Bund became a landmark, massive, modern, housing both offices and luxury apartments. They bought entire neighborhoods in the Hongqiu district. The calculation was clear. Opium might eventually decline, but Shanghai's real estate would only increase in value. The city was becoming China's financial capital, its industrial center, the place where modern China was being born, and the Sassoons owned huge chunks of it. By 1895, annual opium revenues for the Sassoons had actually started to decline slightly, down from peak profits in the 1880s, but real estate income was surging. Rental income from Shanghai properties alone exceeded $500,000 annually. The family was transitioning slowly from drug lords to landlords. But here's the thing, they never stopped selling opium. Even as they diversified, even as they built legitimate businesses, the opium trade continued, because it was still enormously profitable, and because they could. British protection continued, Chinese enforcement remained weak, and millions of addicts needed their supply. One historical record from 1895 shows a typical Sassoon shipment. 3 ships carrying 800 chests of opium departed Calcutta for Shanghai. The moral reckoning never came, not for the Sassoons, not in their lifetime. They died wealthy, honored, respected. Abdullah Sassoon died in 1896, lauded in obituaries as a merchant prince and great philanthropist. The millions of Chinese opium addicts whose lives were destroyed funding that philanthropy weren't mentioned. But the empire's dominance was about to be tested, because the 20th century was coming, and with it, wars, revolutions, and changes that would shake even the mighty Sassoon Empire to its foundation. Chapter 5. Family Fractures. By 1870, the Sassoon Empire faced its greatest threat, not from Chinese authorities, not from British competitors, from itself. David Sassoon had died in 1864, leaving behind a business worth approximately $500,000 and 8 sons who each believed they deserved to run it. The partnership agreement David had created, meticulously designed to keep the family unified, was about to be tested, and it was about to fail spectacularly. The problem was structural. David had built an empire that required absolute unity. Every branch of the business, Bombay operations, Shanghai trading, the opium warehouses, the shipping fleet, the cotton mills, was interconnected. Profits from opium financed the mills. Mills provided legitimate cover for the trading operations. The shipping fleet served everything. Pull one thread and the entire fabric could unravel. But David's sons had different visions for the future and different levels of attachment to the source of their wealth. Abdullah Sassoon, the eldest son who inherited control of the Bombay headquarters, wanted to maintain the traditional model, keep the opium flowing, maximize profits. The British Empire protected the trade. China was too weak to stop it, so why change what worked? Abdullah was a conservative, traditional in dress, orthodox in religion, suspicious of Western education. He saw the family business as David had, a sacred trust to be preserved exactly as built. Elias Sassoon, running Shanghai operations, agreed with his brother, but for different reasons. Elias had spent decades building the distribution networks in China. He knew every comprador, every warehouse, every smuggling route. His entire expertise was in opium. Diversifying meant abandoning the knowledge that made him valuable, So he pushed to expand the opium trade, open new markets in interior China, undercut domestic Chinese production, increase market share even as total volume might decline. But then there was Albert Abdullah David Sassoon, universally called Abdullah the Younger, to distinguish him from his uncle. Born in 1818, educated partially in England, Abdullah the Younger represented the next generation, and he had radically different ideas. Abdullah the Younger looked at the opium trade and saw a ticking time bomb. Not immediately, he wasn't naive about the profits, but long-term, he believed the trade was unsustainable. International pressure was building. China was slowly modernizing. Eventually, the British government would stop protecting opium traders because the diplomatic cost would exceed the benefits. When that happened, families whose entire wealth depended on opium would be destroyed. His solution: diversify aggressively. Use current opium profits to build businesses that could outlast the drug trade. Cotton mills, real estate, banking, legitimate shipping. Make the Sassoon name synonymous with commerce, not narcotics. This created immediate conflict. Diversification required capital that would otherwise be profits distributed to family members. Abdullah the Younger wanted to reinvest 60–70% of annual profits into new ventures. His uncles wanted to take their distributions and maintain their lifestyles. The fights were brutal. Family meetings in Bombay devolved into screaming matches. Letters between Shanghai and Bombay dripped with barely concealed contempt. At one point in 1867, Elias wrote to Abdullah, "You speak of legitimacy like a man ashamed of his father's work. David built this empire on trade the British Empire sanctions. Your cowardice disguised as strategy will destroy what took decades to build." Abdullah the Younger fired back, "I speak of survival. You speak of pride in a business that makes us wealthy criminals in Chinese eyes. When the British abandon us, and they will, your Shanghai warehouses will be ashes and our family will be penniless." The breaking point came in 1867. Abdullah the Younger proposed a massive investment, $100,000 to build modern cotton mills in Bombay using the latest British machinery. The mills would be the largest in India, employing thousands, producing textiles for both Indian and Chinese markets. The return on investment would take years, but once established, the mills would generate steady profits independent of opium. His uncles rejected it. Too expensive, too risky, too much capital tied up in unproven ventures when opium was generating 400% returns. So Abdullah the Younger did something unprecedented. He split from the family business. In 1867, he established E.D. Sassoon and Company, a separate firm using his middle name, Elias David, to distinguish it from David Sassoon and Sons. He took his personal capital, borrowed extensively, and pursued his diversification strategy independently. Some younger family members joined him. Most stayed with the traditional firm. This wasn't just a business split. This was a family civil war. The two firms immediately became competitors. E.D. Sassoon and Company started buying property that David Sassoon and Sons wanted, undercutting them on cotton prices, poaching their employees. The gentlemanly competition of fighting other British trading houses turned into vicious infighting between cousins. Both sides spread rumors. David Sassoon and Sons implied that Abdullah the Younger was financially unstable, over-leveraged, destined for bankruptcy. E.D. Sassoon and Company whispered that the old firm was morally bankrupt, living on borrowed time, unable to adapt. Chinese compradors and British merchants watched in amazement as the Sassoon Empire tore itself apart. But here's what's fascinating. Both strategies worked, at least initially. David Sassoon and Sons, under Abdullah the Elder's conservative management, continued to dominate the opium trade. Between 1867 and 1880, they actually increased market share as smaller competitors failed. The opium profits remained extraordinary. The family members who stayed with the traditional firm became enormously wealthy. Meanwhile, E.D. Sassoon and Company's diversification strategy also succeeded. Abdullah the Younger built his cotton mills. They were profitable within 5 years. He invested heavily in Shanghai real estate, buying entire blocks when prices were low. He established banking operations that financed Chinese and British merchants. By 1880, E.D. Sassoon and Company was worth approximately $300,000, built entirely in 13 years without relying primarily on opium. The family split created something unexpected, competition that pushed both firms to excellence. David Sassoon and Sons couldn't afford to look complacent, while their cousins succeeded with a different model. E.D. Sassoon and Company couldn't afford to fail because the traditional firm would never let them forget it. But the human cost was devastating. Family gatherings became impossible. Weddings and funerals turned into cold, formal affairs where branches of the family barely spoke. The tight-knit Baghdadi Jewish community that David had cultivated fragmented. Some families allied with David Sassoon and Sons, others with E.D. Sassoon and Company. The social fabric David had built to support his business empire was shredding. The religious community particularly suffered. David had been a major patron of Bombay's synagogues. After the split, both firms donated, but competitively. If David Sassoon and Sons funded a new Torah scroll, E.D. Sassoon and Company would fund renovations. The synagogues benefited financially, but became uncomfortable battlegrounds for family pride. There were also attempts at reconciliation. In 1872, several family elders tried to mediate, proposed merging the firms back together, offered Abdullah the Younger significant control in exchange for reunification. The negotiations lasted months, ultimately failed. Neither side would compromise on fundamental strategy: opium dependence versus diversification. The split also had unintended consequences in Shanghai. With two Sassoon firms competing, they drove up prices for everything. Real estate that should have been negotiated cooperatively became bidding wars. Chinese compradors played the firms against each other, demanding better terms from both. The Sassoon advantage, operating as a unified network, disappeared. Other British trading houses noticed. Jardine Matheson, the Sassoons' primary competitor, started gaining ground. When the Sassoons were unified, they could coordinate to control prices and squeeze competitors. When they were split, Jardine could exploit the divisions. By 1875, Jardine Matheson had increased their opium market share from roughly 15% to 25%. The Sassoons, combined across both firms, still controlled about 65%, but they'd lost ground. The decline was entirely self-inflicted. Individual family members tried to maintain relationships across the split. Cousins who'd grown up together didn't want permanent estrangement, but the business rivalry made friendship nearly impossible. If you worked for one firm, you had access to confidential information, prices, strategies, contacts that the other firm desperately wanted. Family dinners became intelligence-gathering operations. One particularly painful incident occurred in 1876. A young Sassoon working for David Sassoon and Sons became engaged to a young woman whose family was close to E.D. Sassoon and Company. Both firms pressured him to break the engagement. The wedding would create a connection across the divide that could leak information. He married her anyway. Both firms effectively disowned him. He left the family business entirely, moved to London and lived comfortably but outside the Sassoon empire. The split also revealed generational tensions. The older generation, David's actual sons, were dying off. Abdullah the Elder died in 1896. Elias died in 1880. As they passed, control shifted to grandchildren who'd never known David personally. For them, the split wasn't a betrayal of family unity. It was just business reality. These younger Sassoons were also more westernized. Many were educated in England, spoke English primarily, married outside the Baghdadi Jewish community. They saw the family business as a commercial enterprise, not a sacred trust. This made them more pragmatic about potential reunification. If merging made financial sense, why not? By 1880, serious merger talks started again. The opium trade was clearly declining. International pressure was building. China's domestic production was undercutting imports. Both Sassoon firms faced the same challenge: adapt or die. Maybe competition had run its course, but egos remained. Neither side wanted to admit the other had been right. David Sassoon and Sons insisted any merger recognize them as the primary entity. E.D. Sassoon and Company would be absorbed, not merged as equals. Abdullah the Younger's successors refused. They'd built an empire without opium dependence. Why should they subordinate to a firm still relying on narcotics? The negotiations collapsed again in 1882. What's interesting is how this split shaped the firm's different fates in the 20th century. David Sassoon and Sons, still heavily dependent on opium, struggled as that trade declined. They diversified too slowly. When opium revenues crashed in the early 1900s, the firm shrank dramatically. By 1920, David Sassoon and Sons was a shadow of its former self. E.D. Sassoon and Company, having diversified decades earlier, weathered the transition better. Their cotton mills thrived. Their Shanghai real estate appreciated enormously. When Victor Sassoon, Abdullah the Younger's grandson, took control in the 1920s, he was running a diversified empire that didn't depend on opium. This is why Victor could dominate Shanghai's property market, while David Sassoon and Sons faded. In retrospect, Abdullah the Younger was right. His strategic vision proved correct, but he paid for that vindication with permanent family estrangement. The split also affected how the Sassoon story was remembered. Because there were two firms with similar names, historians often confused them. Achievements of one were attributed to the other. The family tree became impossible for outsiders to follow. This confusion helped the family later when the opium connection became embarrassing. Nobody could clearly track which Sassoons profited from which activities. There were also periodic rumors of secret coordination, that the split was partially theater, that behind closed doors, the firms shared information and coordinated strategy. These rumors were false. The split was absolutely real, but they persisted because people couldn't believe a family would actually destroy its own unity. By 1890, the generation that remembered the split's origins was dying. Younger family members knew they were supposed to maintain the rivalry, but increasingly didn't understand why. They were competing against cousins they barely knew over grievances from before they were born. Some reconciliation happened at individual levels. Cousins would meet privately, attend each other's social events, even discuss business informally. But the firms remained separate. The institutional split, once created, had become permanent. The tragedy is that David Sassoon had designed the original partnership specifically to prevent this. He'd seen other trading families fragment and fail. He'd created elaborate agreements to keep his sons unified. But he couldn't legislate personality, couldn't force his descendants to share his vision, couldn't prevent the ambitions and egos that ultimately tore the empire apart. By 1900, the Sassoon name appeared on two distinct firms with different strategies, different leadership, and minimal cooperation. Both were wealthy, both were influential, but together they could have been unstoppable. Instead, they spent decades fighting each other instead of dominating their markets. And this internal conflict, as much as external changes, determined how the Sassoon Empire ultimately evolved and eventually collapsed. Because when the real threats came, Japanese invasion, communist revolution, the Sassoons faced them divided, not unified. The family fracture that began in 1867 never truly healed. And that fracture, hidden beneath the surface of continued wealth and influence, was a crack that would eventually shatter the entire empire. Chapter 6: Total Domination. The period from 1900 to 1920 should have been disaster for the Sassoons. China's Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. World War I disrupted global trade. Anti-opium movements gained strength internationally. The British government, facing pressure, began publicly distancing itself from the opium trade. Instead, the Sassoons became richer and more powerful than ever. How? By being more ruthless than anyone else. Victor Sassoon took over Shanghai operations in 1924, but his influence started much earlier. Born in 1881 into staggering wealth, Victor was different from his ancestors. David Sassoon had been a pious refugee. Elias had been a careful trader. Abdullah had been a philanthropist seeking British acceptance. Victor was a playboy capitalist with no illusions about the source of his wealth. He walked with a cane after a plane crash in World War I left him partially disabled. He raced horses, kept mistresses, threw legendary parties, and ran the Sassoon business empire with absolute ruthless efficiency. The opium trade was dying, slowly but undeniably. International pressure had forced Britain to sign agreements limiting opium exports. China's new Republican government, desperate for legitimacy, was cracking down harder. Chinese domestic production was undercutting imports. By 1917, official opium imports to China had dropped to roughly 2,000 tons annually, less than a third of peak levels. But Victor understood something crucial. The dying opium trade had already served its purpose. It had generated the capital needed to dominate Shanghai's real economy. And Shanghai was about to experience the most explosive growth in its history. Between 1920 and 1937, Shanghai's population doubled to 3.5 million people. The city became Asia's financial capital, its manufacturing center, its cultural hub. The Paris of the East wasn't marketing, it was reality. Art Deco skyscrapers, jazz clubs, international banks, the first Chinese stock exchange, cinema houses, universities. Shanghai had more cars than any other Asian city, more telephones, more electricity consumption. And the Sassoons owned massive pieces of it all. Victor's strategy was simple but brilliant. Use the remaining opium profits and accumulated capital to buy trophy assets. Not just any real estate, the most visible, most prestigious, most profitable properties in Shanghai. In 1926, Victor opened the Cathay Hotel on the Bund. This wasn't just a hotel, this was a statement. 10 stories of luxury, Art Deco masterpiece, the finest accommodations in Asia. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives while staying there. Charlie Chaplin visited. Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII honeymooned in the penthouse suite. The Cathay became the symbol of Shanghai's glamorous cosmopolitan identity. The hotel cost $500,000 to build, roughly $75 million in today's money. But it generated enormous returns. Room rates were astronomical. The top-floor restaurant became where Shanghai's elite, both foreign and Chinese, did business. The bar was legendary. Victor often held court there personally, schmoozing with taipans, generals, gangsters, and socialites. But the Cathay was just the flagship. Victor owned dozens of properties: the Embankment Building, Metropole Hotel, Grosvenor House, Hamilton House, entire blocks of apartments in the French concession. The Sassoon real estate portfolio in Shanghai was worth an estimated $3 million by 1930, approximately $450 million today. Here's what most people don't know. Victor wasn't just collecting rent. He was manipulating the entire Shanghai property market. The Sassoons controlled so much real estate that they could influence prices across the city. When they bought, prices rose. When they sold, which was rare, prices dropped. They were too big to compete with. One example shows how this worked. In 1928, an American bank wanted to build headquarters on the Bund. They approached Victor about purchasing a Sassoon-owned lot. Victor quoted them an absurd price, 3 times market rate. They balked, tried to find alternative locations. But every prime site on the Bund was owned by either the Sassoons or their close associates. Eventually, the bank paid Victor's price. He'd essentially created a monopoly on Shanghai's most valuable land, and he was diversifying beyond real estate. The Sassoons invested heavily in Shanghai's cotton mills. By 1930, Sassoon-controlled mills employed over 30,000 Chinese workers and produced roughly 15% of China's cotton textiles. They invested in utilities, electric power, water systems. They owned shares in the Shanghai Stock Exchange. They financed Chinese entrepreneurs through the Sassoon banking operations. Think about the transformation. 3 generations earlier, David Sassoon had been a refugee with nothing. Now his grandson controlled significant chunks of China's largest city's infrastructure, employed tens of thousands, and wielded influence that rivaled governments. But Victor maintained the family's original edge, willingness to operate in moral gray zones. While the opium trade was officially dying, Victor found new ways to profit from vice. He invested in Shanghai's nightclub district, financed casinos. His properties housed brothels, high-end establishments catering to wealthy foreigners and Chinese. Shanghai in the 1920s was called the Whore of the Orient, and the Sassoons profited from that reputation. Victor also cultivated relationships with Shanghai's criminal underworld. The Green Gang, Shanghai's most powerful triad, controlled gambling, prostitution, and what remained of the opium trade. Their leader, Du Yuesheng, was one of Shanghai's most feared men. Victor did business with him, attended his parties, used green gang muscle when necessary to resolve property disputes or enforce contracts. This alliance was mutually beneficial. The triads needed legitimate business fronts. The Sassoons needed enforcement muscle that operated outside British or Chinese law. Together they controlled vast swaths of Shanghai's shadow economy. One incident from 1931 illustrates this perfectly. A Chinese businessman refused to vacate a Sassoon-owned building after his lease expired. Legal eviction would take months. Victor mentioned the problem to Du Yuesheng at a dinner party. Within 48 hours, the tenant had voluntarily left. No violence was reported, but everyone understood what green gang persuasion meant. The Sassoons were also playing both sides of Chinese politics. When Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces took Shanghai in 1927, Victor immediately cultivated relationships with the new government. He hosted nationalist officials, made loans to Chiang's government, donated to nationalist causes. When Chiang married Sung Mei-ling from one of China's wealthiest families, Victor attended the wedding. But Victor also maintained relationships with the foreign powers, British, American, French, that controlled Shanghai's international settlement. He served on the Shanghai Municipal Council, advised the British consul, hosted visiting dignitaries. He was playing a complex game, being British enough for the British, Chinese enough for the Chinese, and loyal to nobody except Sassoon interests. The wealth was staggering. By 1935, Victor Sassoon's personal fortune was estimated at $8 million, approximately $1.2 billion in today's money. The broader Sassoon family controlled assets worth perhaps 3 times that. They owned property across Asia, Bombay, Calcutta, Hong Kong, Singapore. They had investments in London. They were truly global. Victor lived like it. His estate outside Shanghai, Eve's Ranch, spawned 170 acres. He bred championship racehorses. His stable won the Shanghai Race Club Championship 5 times in the 1930s. He owned a fleet of cars, traveled by private ship, through parties where champagne flowed like water and guest lists mixed Chinese warlords with European aristocrats. But underneath the glamour, Victor was watching China's political situation carefully. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931. Tensions were rising. Chinese nationalism was growing. The communists, though suppressed by Chiang Kai-shek, were gaining strength in rural areas. The international system that had protected foreign privileges in China for a century was cracking. Victor began quietly preparing exit strategies. He diversified investments outside China, moved liquid capital to British banks, maintained close relationships with British and American officials who might help evacuate assets if necessary. He partied like a playboy, but he planned like a survivor. In 1937, everything changed. Japanese forces attacked Shanghai. The Battle of Shanghai raged for 3 months. Over 250,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians died. The city was devastated. The international settlement remained technically neutral, a bizarre island of peace surrounded by war. But everyone knew it was temporary. Victor faced a choice: stay and bet on Shanghai's recovery, or start moving assets out. He chose both. Publicly, he remained optimistic, kept the Cathay Hotel operating, maintained his Shanghai properties. But privately, he was transferring capital, securing foreign accounts, preparing for the worst. What he couldn't know was just how bad the worst would be, because the war that was coming wouldn't just threaten the Sassoon Empire, it would destroy it completely. Chapter 7: War Profits. The Japanese invasion of Shanghai in 1937 should have been catastrophic for Victor Sassoon. Foreign property owners fled. Banks closed. The stock exchange suspended operations. Battle damage destroyed neighborhoods. The Chinese population that remained faced starvation and terror. Victor made money. Astonishing amounts of it. Here's how. The international settlement remained neutral territory for 4 years after the invasion. Japanese forces surrounded it, but didn't occupy it until after Pearl Harbor in 1941. This created a bizarre situation, a 2-square-mile bubble of foreign-controlled territory surrounded by Japanese-occupied China, where normal laws and commerce had completely collapsed. Shanghai became a refuge. Wealthy Chinese fleeing Japanese-controlled areas poured into the settlement with whatever portable wealth they could carry. European Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany arrived by the thousands. Shanghai was one of the few cities that didn't require entry visas. Russian émigrés, American adventurers, British traders who couldn't or wouldn't evacuate, they all crammed into the settlement. Real estate prices should have crashed. Supply exceeded demand. War surrounded the city. Instead, Victor pushed them higher. You see, desperate people with money will pay anything for safety. A cramped apartment in the international settlement meant protection from Japanese occupation. Victor owned hundreds of such apartments. He raised rents by 200%, sometimes 300%. Tenants paid because the alternative was Japanese military rule. One survivor account describes this perfectly. We arrived from Vienna with nothing but my mother's jewelry and my father's savings. The Sassoon rental agent demanded 6 months advance rent, at rates triple what we'd paid for our apartment in Vienna. We paid. What choice did we have? The Japanese were at the gates. Victor wasn't just profiting from rentals. He was buying distressed assets. Chinese businessmen, desperate to flee, would sell properties for pennies on the dollar just to get cash they could carry. Victor bought them all. Office buildings, warehouses, entire blocks in the Chinese districts that had been abandoned. He paid cash, got massive discounts, waited for Shanghai to recover. The Cathay Hotel remained open throughout the war. It became the neutral meeting ground where Japanese officers, Chinese collaborators, Western diplomats and smugglers all mingled. Victor maintained strict neutrality. Anyone with money was welcome. The bar did record business. The restaurant was packed. Room rates doubled, then tripled. What most people don't understand about Victor's wartime operations is how systematically he monetized human desperation. This wasn't opportunistic profiteering. It was a calculated business strategy executed with cold precision. Between 1937 and 1941, approximately 20,000 Jewish refugees arrived in Shanghai from Nazi-occupied Europe. Shanghai was literally the last option. The United States had closed its doors. Britain restricted immigration. Palestine had quotas. Australia, South Africa, Latin America all turned refugees away. Shanghai alone remained open because it didn't require visas. You could just show up. The refugees arrived with whatever they could carry. Many had been wealthy in Europe. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, academics. Now they were stateless, desperate, and completely dependent on whoever controlled Shanghai's housing. Victor controlled most of it, and he charged accordingly. The standard Sassoon apartment in 1936 rented for approximately 80 Shanghai dollars per month, roughly $25 US at the time. By 1939, with refugees flooding the city, Victor was charging 300 Shanghai dollars for the same apartments. Same buildings, same conditions, just a 275% price increase because demand exceeded supply. But here's what's particularly calculating. Victor created a tiered rental system specifically designed to extract maximum revenue from refugees at different wealth levels. Tier 1 were the luxury apartments in Sassoon House and the French concession properties. These went for 501,000 Shanghai dollars monthly. Only the wealthiest refugees could afford them. Families who'd managed to smuggle out substantial assets, usually in the form of diamonds, gold, or foreign currency. Victor knew exactly who these people were. His rental agents screened applicants carefully. If you had money, you got offered the premium properties. Tier 2 were the standard apartments in the Hongkou district, Shanghai's designated area for refugee housing. These were the 300 Shanghai dollar rentals. Middle-class refugees, families who had some savings but not fortunes, ended up here. The apartments were cramped, often housing 6 to 8 people in spaces designed for 2 to 3. But they were safe from the Japanese, and that's what mattered. Tier 3 were the subdivided tenements. Victor took existing apartments and carved them into smaller units. A 2-bedroom became 4 studio spaces. A living room became a sleeping room for 3 families. The total rent collected from one subdivided apartment often exceeded 1,000 Shanghai dollars monthly, far more than renting the original apartment, intact. The refugees in these spaces were the poorest, people who'd arrived with literally nothing, who relied on charity from refugee aid organizations to pay even these minimal rents. Victor collected rent from organizations like the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, knowing they had no choice but to pay. The alternative was leaving refugees homeless, which would have been a humanitarian catastrophe. One refugee who survived this period later wrote, "We lived in what had been a storage closet. 7 of us, my parents, my siblings, and me. No windows, one door. We hung a sheet down the middle to create rooms. The rent was 40 Shanghai dollars monthly, more than my father had earned in a month as a lawyer in Berlin. But we paid it. Mr. Sassoon owned the building. There was nowhere else to go. Think about the math." Victor had approximately 800 residential properties in Shanghai by 1940. If even half were generating double or triple pre-war rents, that's 400 properties, x an extra 200 Shanghai dollars monthly, x 12 months, 960,000 Shanghai dollars in extra annual revenue. At 1940 exchange rates, that's roughly $300,000 US, equivalent to about $6.5 million today, from rent increases alone. During a humanitarian crisis, while families slept in closets, but Victor justified it internally with impeccable capitalist logic. He was providing housing. Without Sassoon properties, these refugees would be homeless. The prices were set by market forces, supply and demand. If he charged less, the apartments would be snapped up by whoever got there first, and equally desperate people would still be homeless. The price system allocated scarce housing to those who valued it most, i.e., could pay the most. This was efficient, rational, good economics. It was also morally grotesque. But Victor had long since separated business decisions from moral considerations. Victor's other major wartime profit source was currency manipulation. Shanghai in the late 1930s had one of the most chaotic currency situations in history. Multiple currencies circulated simultaneously, Chinese yuan rapidly inflating, Shanghai dollars, pegged to silver, more stable, Japanese military yen forced into circulation in occupied areas, US dollars, scarce, highly valued, British pounds, also scarce, used for international transactions. Gold bars, the ultimate safe haven, Victor's banking operations let him play these currencies against each other. He'd accept rent payments in any currency, but the exchange rates he offered were deliberately unfavorable to tenants. Pay in devaluing yuan, and Victor would apply an exchange rate 15 to 20% worse than the official rate. Pay in scarce US dollars, and you'd get a slight premium. But Victor would immediately convert those dollars to pounds and move them to accounts in London, getting the dollars out of China before currency controls could trap them. One particularly clever scheme involved Japanese military yen. The Japanese occupation government forced Chinese businesses in occupied territories to accept military yen at par with Chinese yuan. But everyone knew military yen were essentially worthless outside Japanese-controlled areas. So they were printed by the Japanese army, backed by nothing, and would become completely valueless if Japan lost the war. Victor's agents would accept military yen from desperate Chinese businessmen who needed to convert them to something useful before they became worthless. Victor would offer exchange rates of 100 military yen for 40 Shanghai dollars, a massive discount. The businessmen would take it because 40 Shanghai dollars were better than potentially worthless military yen. Then Victor would use those military yen to pay expenses in Japanese-occupied territories. Bribes to Japanese officials, payments to suppliers, purchase of confiscated properties. He was converting worthless paper into real assets, using the currency's brief window of forced validity before its inevitable collapse. When Japan surrendered in 1945, people holding military yen lost everything. Victor had already converted his military yen holdings into property and goods months earlier. He lost nothing. The currency operations also served another purpose: capital flight. Victor needed to move wealth out of China in case the situation deteriorated further. But China had capital controls. You couldn't just transfer millions abroad without government permission. So Victor used a Hawala-style system through Sassoon banking operations. A wealthy Chinese businessman in Shanghai would deposit yuan with Victor's Shanghai bank. Victor would then arrange for an equivalent amount in pounds to be available to the businessman in London through the Sassoon banking house there. On paper, no money crossed borders. In reality, wealth was moving constantly. Victor charged 8 to 12% for these transactions, pure profit. And he was helping wealthy Chinese evade capital controls, while simultaneously moving his own wealth to safety. By 1940, Victor had moved an estimated $1.5 million to London banks, roughly $225 million in today's money. Just in case Shanghai became completely untenable, Victor also profited massively from the black market, though he was careful to maintain plausible deniability. With normal trade routes destroyed and the international settlement surrounded, Shanghai's economy ran entirely on smuggling. Everything was smuggled: medicine, food, fuel, weapons, luxury goods. Opium, of course, heroin, morphine. Even people getting someone out of Japanese-occupied territory into the settlement cost money, and smugglers charged accordingly. Victor didn't directly participate in smuggling, too risky for someone of his prominence, but he financed it, provided warehouse space, laundered money through his banks, and took a cut of everything. Here's how it worked. A smuggler would need warehouse space to store contraband before distribution. Victor owned dozens of warehouses. He'd lease space to the smuggler at exorbitant rates, 3 to 5 times normal warehouse rents. The lease agreement would carefully not mention what was being stored. Victor maintained plausible deniability. If authorities raided the warehouse and found contraband, the smuggler would be arrested, not Victor. He was just a landlord. The smuggler would also need financing. Buying contraband in occupied territory, bribing Japanese guards to look the other way, paying boat captains to make dangerous runs, all this required capital. Victor's banking operations would provide loans at 15–25% interest. Short-term loans, 30–90 days. If you didn't pay back on time, the interest compounded viciously. Some smugglers defaulted. When they did, Victor would seize collateral, usually the contraband itself. Then he'd sell it through different channels, making the profit the smuggler should have made, plus recovering the loan. One particularly profitable arrangement involved medicine. Refugees and the Chinese population desperately needed medicine, antibiotics, anesthetics, surgical supplies. Normal supply chains were destroyed. Hospitals were overwhelmed. People were dying from treatable conditions. Victor financed smuggling operations that brought medicine from Japanese-occupied areas or from neutral territories like Macau. The medicine would be stored in Sassoon warehouses. Then it would be sold at 500–1,000% markups. A vial of penicillin that cost $2 wholesale would sell for $20 in Shanghai. Life-saving medicine became a luxury good. Was Victor directly selling the medicine? No, his agents and partners handled that, but he financed the operation, stored the product, and took a percentage, typically 30–40% of profits. When you're making 1,000% margins, giving Victor 30% still leaves enormous profit. The same system applied to food. Malnutrition was widespread in Shanghai by 1939. Rice prices skyrocketed. Vegetable supplies were erratic. The Chinese population in occupied territories was starving. The Japanese confiscated food for their military, leaving civilians with almost nothing. Smuggled rice from the Chinese interior could be sold at massive markups in Shanghai. Victor financed these operations, stored the rice in Sassoon warehouses, took his cut. Meanwhile, outside those warehouses, Chinese civilians starved because they couldn't afford the inflated prices. One account from a refugee doctor describes visiting a Sassoon warehouse in 1940. I'd heard rumors of food supplies, went to investigate. The warehouse was full, bags of rice stacked to the ceiling, thousands of bags. I asked the guard if I could purchase some for the refugee hospital. He quoted a price that was astronomical, 10 times what rice should cost. I explained that people were dying. He shrugged, said if I couldn't pay, I should leave. Outside, I saw Chinese children, visibly malnourished, staring at the warehouse. All that food, all those hungry people. But no money means no food. Victor's response to such criticisms, when he bothered responding, was textbook capitalism. He hadn't created the shortage. He hadn't caused the war. He was simply operating businesses in a difficult environment. The high prices reflected genuine scarcity and risk. Smuggling was dangerous. Boats got intercepted, smugglers got arrested or killed. High prices compensated for high risk. Moreover, he'd argue, the black market was performing an essential service. Without smugglers, there would be no food, no medicine, no supplies at all. The black market, however inefficient and expensive, was better than nothing. His warehouses, his financing, his infrastructure, these enabled the smuggling that kept Shanghai functioning. This is technically true. The black market did provide goods that otherwise wouldn't exist. But that doesn't make profiteering from starvation and disease ethical. It just makes it economically rational. Victor's relationship with the Japanese occupation government was one of the most morally complicated aspects of his wartime activity. He walked an incredibly fine line, cooperating enough that the Japanese didn't cause him problems, but maintaining enough distance to preserve his British identity and post-war credibility. The Japanese wanted to use Sassoon properties for military purposes. Hotels for officer housing, warehouses for military supplies, office buildings for occupation administration. Victor could have refused, but refusal would have meant confiscation. The Japanese would simply seize what they wanted. So Victor negotiated. He leased properties to the Japanese at what he called market rates, but what were actually inflated prices. A building worth 500 Shanghai dollars monthly in rent would be leased to the Japanese military for $800. The Japanese paid because they wanted to maintain a veneer of legality. They were leasing, not stealing. This arrangement made Victor complicit in the occupation. Japanese officers planning operations against Chinese forces were housed in Sassoon hotels. Japanese military supplies were stored in Sassoon warehouses. The infrastructure Victor controlled enabled the occupation. But Victor framed it differently. He was protecting his property. The Japanese could have simply seized everything. By leasing instead, he maintained legal ownership and received payment. After the war, he'd still own the buildings. Owners who'd refused to cooperate had lost everything to outright confiscation. The moral problem is that this logic makes collaboration seem rational. Every property owner who cooperated with occupation forces used similar reasoning, and collectively, their cooperation made the occupation function more smoothly. Victor also maintained social relationships with Japanese officials. He attended dinners, hosted Japanese officers at the Cathay Hotel bar, exchanged pleasantries, never directly discussed politics, but maintained cordial relations. One particularly controversial incident occurred in 1940. A Japanese general requested a meeting with Victor. The general wanted to requisition the entire Cathay Hotel for use as Japanese military headquarters. Victor's response was masterful manipulation. He served tea, chatted about the general's family, admired the general's sword, asked about its history, built rapport, then gently explained that the Cathay Hotel served a valuable function as neutral ground. It was where Japanese officers could meet with Western diplomats, Chinese collaborators and business leaders in a setting that wasn't overtly military. Converting it to military headquarters would eliminate this valuable neutral space. The general considered this. Victor then offered an alternative. He would reserve an entire floor of the hotel for permanent Japanese military use at favorable rates. The Japanese would have dedicated space, but the hotel would remain technically civilian and continue serving its neutral function. The general agreed. Victor kept his hotel operating. The Japanese got their space, and Victor collected rent for accommodations he couldn't otherwise have sold Western guests. Weren't exactly flooding into Shanghai, but this meant Japanese military officers were living in the Cathay Hotel, planning operations there, meeting there. The hotel became effectively part of the occupation infrastructure. While maintaining its reputation as neutral ground, critics at the time, mostly Chinese who'd fled the occupation, accused Victor of outright collaboration. They pointed out that he was profiting from Japanese occupation, housing Japanese officers, providing material support to the enemy. Victor's defenders, mostly Western businessmen in similar positions, argued he had no choice. Britain and Japan weren't at war yet, until December 1941. British subjects in Shanghai had to maintain working relationships with the de facto authorities. Refusing to cooperate would have meant losing everything without helping anyone. Both positions have truth. Victor was collaborating with an occupying force that was committing atrocities against the Chinese population. He was profiting from that collaboration. This is morally indefensible, but he was also protecting property and livelihoods, not just his own, but his employees, his tenants, the refugees living in his buildings. Total non-cooperation would have meant confiscation and homelessness for thousands. The reality is that moral purity wasn't an option. Everyone in occupied Shanghai was compromised. The question was degree. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the United States. Britain declared war on Japan. Overnight, Victor went from neutral businessman to enemy alien. Japanese forces immediately occupied the international settlement. The legal fiction that had protected foreign businesses vanished. British and American citizens were declared enemy aliens and subject to internment. The Cathay Hotel was seized and converted into Japanese military headquarters. No negotiations this time, just confiscation. Sassoon properties across Shanghai were requisitioned. The luxury apartments Victor had been renting to refugees were converted to Japanese officer housing. The warehouses became military supply depots. The office buildings became occupation administration centers. Everything Victor had spent decades building was taken in a matter of days, but Victor had prepared. In the months before Pearl Harbor, as tensions between Japan and the Western powers escalated, Victor had quietly moved assets, transferred liquid capital to Bombay and London, converted properties he couldn't protect into gold and currency that could be hidden or smuggled, sold assets to neutral parties, and moved the proceeds offshore. When Japanese authorities came to arrest him in December 1941, they found Victor cooperative, almost cheerful. He had a bag packed. He'd known this was coming. He smiled, shook hands with the Japanese officers, and allowed himself to be taken to the civilian internment camp without protest. The Japanese were suspicious. Why was he so calm? They searched Sassoon house thoroughly, found records of recent property sales, asset transfers, and financial transactions, tried to freeze Sassoon accounts in Shanghai banks, but the money was already gone, moved to institutions outside Japanese control. The internment camp was miserable but not brutal. The Japanese treated British internees as prisoners of war, not as concentration camp victims. Conditions were poor. Inadequate food, no medical care, crowded barracks, forced labor details. But it was survivable. Victor, at 60 years old and in poor health, struggled. The camp diet was rice and vegetables, minimal protein. His war injury, the leg damaged in the 1914 plane crash, worsened without proper medical care. He lost significant weight, developed infections, spent periods in the camp infirmary, but he survived. And mentally he remained sharp. He watched, observed who among the Japanese guards could be bribed, which internees were actually Japanese informants, what information was valuable. Even in internment, Victor was gathering intelligence and calculating angles. One fellow internee later described Victor in the camp. He was the only man I knew who seemed almost relaxed in that hell. Everyone else was consumed with anxiety, about family, about property, about whether we'd survive. Victor played bridge, read books that other internees shared, discussed philosophy. It was as if he'd accepted the situation completely and decided to wait it out with grace. Only later did I realize he wasn't anxious because he'd already protected his wealth. The rest of us had lost everything. Victor had lost buildings but saved his fortune. Meanwhile, outside the camp, Victor's properties were being systematically looted. The Japanese converted Sassoon house for military use, stripped the Cathay Hotel of its furnishings, artwork and fixtures, sold Sassoon assets to Japanese corporations at token prices. The physical Sassoon empire in Shanghai was being destroyed piece by piece, but the empire was more than buildings. The real wealth, the liquid assets, the foreign holdings, the gold reserves was safe. Victor's cousin Derek Fitzgerald Sassoon was running the Indian operations, the Bombay mills, the Calcutta trading houses, the banking operations. These remained operational and profitable throughout the war. So while Victor sat in an internment camp, losing weight and battling infections, the Sassoon family business was actually growing in India. British war contracts for textiles, increased demand for Sassoon banking services, investments in Indian infrastructure projects. The war that destroyed the Chinese operations enriched the Indian operations. Victor understood this completely. He told fellow internees, "I've lost Shanghai. For now, but Shanghai isn't everything. The family survives. The business continues. And when this war ends, and it will end, I'll rebuild." He had no idea how wrong he was about rebuilding Shanghai, but his assessment of the broader Sassoon Empire's survival was correct. They would survive, just not in China. Chapter 8: Underground Networks. What made the Sassoons different from other opium traders wasn't just volume, it was infrastructure. By 1880, they'd built a distribution network so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in China's economy, that even the Chinese government couldn't fully map it. This is the part of the Sassoon story that historians struggle to document. Because it was illegal, because it operated in shadows, because the people involved had every reason to destroy evidence. But enough records survived: letters, account books, testimony from Chinese officials, missionary reports, to reconstruct how the machine actually worked. Start with the ships. The Sassoon fleet in 1880 numbered 37 vessels. But these weren't just cargo ships sailing from Bombay to Shanghai. They were a coordinated network with specialized roles. The large steamships, 8 of them, made the primary India to China runs. These were legitimate vessels, registered with British maritime authorities carrying declared cargo. Mostly cotton, textiles, and medicinal supplies, the opium was hidden. False bottoms in cargo holds, sealed compartments behind legitimate goods. Ships' manifests listed 200 chests of cargo. The actual number was 600. But here's the clever part. Even if Chinese customs inspectors searched the ships, finding the hidden opium was nearly impossible without tearing the vessel apart. And the Sassoons had bribed enough customs officials that searches rarely happened. When they did happen, they were perfunctory. Inspectors who'd been paid to look but not see. Then there were the smaller coastal vessels, 29 of them. These shuttled opium from major ports to smaller cities along China's coast and rivers. A large shipment would arrive in Shanghai. Within days, it would be broken up and redistributed to Ningbo, Wenzhou, Fuzhou, Xiamen, and dozens of smaller ports. This dispersion made enforcement impossible. Chinese authorities could monitor Shanghai, but they couldn't monitor every small harbor simultaneously. The coastal network also served another purpose: plausible deniability. The big Sassoon ships never directly delivered to the most illegal markets. The coastal vessels, often registered under different names or operated by Chinese partners, handled the truly criminal distribution. If one got caught, it couldn't be directly traced to the Sassoons, now the warehouses. The Sassoons operated approximately 60 warehouses across China by 1885, but only about 20 were officially registered as Sassoon properties. The others were owned by Chinese compradors, other foreign traders, or shell companies that existed only on paper. The system worked like this. Opium arrived in Shanghai at an official Sassoon warehouse. It was logged in the books. Then it would be sold to a comprador, a Chinese middleman who would move it to his warehouse. But the comprador was often just a Sassoon employee using a Chinese name. The opium hadn't really changed hands. It had just moved from one part of the Sassoon network to another while becoming harder to trace. From comprador warehouses, the opium flowed to distribution networks the Sassoons didn't directly control, but absolutely depended on: the triads. Chinese organized crime, primarily the Green Gang in Shanghai, the Red Gang in other regions, handled the actual street-level distribution. They ran the opium dens, they sold to individual addicts, they enforced payment, they eliminated competitors. The Sassoons provided the supply, the triads provided the distribution. This relationship was mutually beneficial and deeply corrupt. The triads needed reliable, high-quality opium to maintain their dens. The Sassoons needed distribution networks that could operate despite police raids and government crackdowns. Together, they created a system that was nearly impossible to shut down. The financial arrangements were complex. The Sassoons sold opium to triad leaders on credit. The triads paid after selling to dens and addicts. This meant the Sassoons were essentially financing the entire distribution chain. But it also meant they controlled it. A triad that didn't pay faced cut-off from supply. In the opium business, that meant bankruptcy or death. One document from 1882, a ledger seized by Chinese authorities and later translated, shows how this worked. Received from Sassoon warehouse, 50 chests Patna first grade. Value 60,000 taels. Payment terms 45 days. Distribution: 15 chests to Hongkou district dens, 20 chests to Chapei district, 15 chests to French concession establishments. Current dens supplied 47. Estimated users 8,200. Projected revenue 84,000 taels. Profit 24,000 taels split 60% to syndicate, 40% to suppliers. Think about those numbers. One shipment of 50 chests was supplying 8,200 addicts through 47 dens, and that was just one comprador's operation. The Sassoons had dozens of such partners across China. The scale becomes staggering when you map it. Historians estimate that by 1885, the Sassoon distribution network touched approximately 15,000 opium dens across China. These weren't all directly supplied, many were several steps removed in the distribution chain, but they all ultimately traced back to Sassoon opium, and the dens themselves represented an entire shadow economy. They weren't just places to smoke opium. They were financial institutions for the poor. Addicts would pawn belongings to get opium. The dens would sell those belongings. Many dens offered credit: smoke now, pay later. When addicts couldn't pay, they'd work off debts. Sometimes this meant legitimate labor. Often it meant prostitution or crime. The Sassoons understood this ecosystem completely. They received detailed reports from compradors about den operations, user numbers, consumption patterns. These weren't just commercial reports. They were market research for addiction. One particularly chilling document from 1887 shows a Sassoon agent in Ningbo reporting to Shanghai headquarters. Den operations in the city have expanded to 12 establishments from 8 last year. User base estimated at 2,400, up from 1,600. However, average consumption per user has declined 15%, likely due to economic hardship reducing purchasing power. Recommend selective price reductions in lower-grade product to maintain volume while protecting premium margins. Read that again. They were analyzing how poverty affected addicts' ability to buy opium, then adjusting prices to maximize sales volume. This was addiction as business science. The network also included Chinese officials, not just low-level customs inspectors, provincial governors, military commanders, police chiefs. Anyone with enforcement power needed to be compromised. The Sassoons rarely bribed directly, too risky, too traceable. Instead, they used intermediaries. A comprador would have relationships with officials, would make gifts at appropriate times, fund their children's educations, provide loans at favorable terms, offer business partnerships that were really just bribes disguised as investments. One British missionary in Shanghai documented this in an 1889 letter. The opium trade's persistence is explained entirely by official corruption. I have personally witnessed a Chinese magistrate, supposedly charged with suppressing opium, dining at a known opium merchant's home. The same magistrate later conducted a raid that somehow missed the largest opium warehouse in his district while seizing product from a small competitor who'd refused to pay protection. This corruption reached the highest levels. There are documented cases of provincial governors owning shares in opium distribution operations, of military commanders providing armed escorts for opium shipments, of police forces that existed primarily to protect favored opium dealers while harassing others. The Sassoons didn't create this corruption. It existed before they arrived. But they perfected it, systematized it, turned it into a reliable business infrastructure. The system also included information networks. The Sassoons needed to know about government plans to crack down on opium, about anti-opium reformers gaining influence, about competing trafficking operations, about changing consumption patterns. They had informants everywhere. Chinese servants in British consular offices who overheard diplomatic conversations, clerks in Chinese government bureaus who copied official correspondence, missionaries who inadvertently revealed information about anti-opium movements. The Sassoons knew what Chinese authorities planned before Chinese authorities executed those plans. This intelligence network saved them repeatedly. In 1883, a reformist official in Jiangsu province planned a massive coordinated raid on opium warehouses. He'd carefully kept it secret, told no one outside his inner circle. The raids were scheduled for dawn on a specific date. The Sassoons knew 2 days in advance. Their warehouses were emptied. The opium moved to temporary locations. When the raids happened, authorities found nearly empty buildings. The official was humiliated. Removed from office, the Sassoons had their opium back in the warehouses within a week. How did they know? A clerk in the official's office was sleeping with a woman whose brother worked for a Sassoon comprador. She casually mentioned her lover's upcoming important action. The brother reported it. The information traveled up the Sassoon network. Action was taken. This kind of intelligence network costs money. The Sassoons spent approximately $50,000 annually, roughly $7.5 million today, just on information gathering and protection payments. But it was wildly profitable. That $50,000 protected opium sales worth over $2 million annually. The network also extended to opium production in India. The Sassoons didn't just buy opium at auction. They had agents embedded with growers. These agents provided seeds, loaned money for planting, offered technical advice on cultivation. In exchange, growers sold exclusively to the Sassoons at negotiated prices. This vertical integration meant the Sassoons controlled quality from the poppy field to the opium den. They could guarantee consistency, crucial in a market where users could tell the difference between good and bad opium. They could also manipulate supply. If they wanted to drive prices up, they'd tell their growers to hold back harvest. If they wanted to flood the market and destroy competitors, they'd release stored inventory. One account from 1890 describes a Sassoon agent visiting opium fields in Bihar. I spent 3 weeks traveling the growing regions. Met with 47 cultivators who've contracted with our firm. Advanced them a total of 18,000 rupees for next season's planting. In exchange, they'll deliver their entire harvest to our Calcutta warehouse at 230 rupees per chest, approximately 15% below current market rates. If market prices decline, we've secured discount supply. If prices rise, we've locked in massive margins. The Sassoons were essentially running an early version of agricultural futures trading, but with opium, and with cultivators who had no choice but to accept whatever. Terms were offered because the Sassoons controlled access to capital and markets. The banking infrastructure supporting all this was equally sophisticated. The Sassoons operated their own banking houses in Bombay, Calcutta, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. These weren't formal banks with charters. They were private financial operations that existed primarily to support the opium trade. They provided credit to compradors, exchanged currencies, managed accounts for Chinese partners who needed to hide wealth from authorities, transferred money across borders using bills of exchange that avoided customs scrutiny. They were running a complete shadow financial system, one particularly innovative technique. The Sassoons would accept Chinese silk, tea, or other exports as payment for opium. They'd then sell these goods in London or New York, converting them to British pounds or American dollars. This meant Chinese addicts were essentially paying for opium with Chinese export goods, which the Sassoons then sold for Western currency. It was extraction on top of extraction. The human toll of this network was almost incomprehensible. By 1890, historians estimate China had approximately 15 million opium addicts. The Sassoons supplied roughly 70% of imported opium, which represented about half of total Chinese consumption, the other half being domestic Chinese production. So the Sassoons were directly responsible for supplying approximately 5.25 million addicts, 5 million people, each one with a family. Each one whose addiction destroyed lives, drained family savings, prevented economic development. Multiply 5 million addicts by an average family size of 5, and you get 25 million Chinese people directly affected by Sassoon opium. 25 million lives damaged to build one family's fortune. The Sassoons knew exactly what they were doing. The archives contain letters where family members discuss addiction rates, den operations user numbers, always in clinical, business language, but with complete awareness of what they were selling. One letter from Elias, Sassoon in Shanghai to his brother in Bombay from 1875. The expansion of establishments in Hongkou district proceeds satisfactorily. Estimates suggest user base has grown 23% year over year. The social degradation is lamentable. But demand remains robust, and our competitors show no signs of restraint. If we abandon this market, others would merely capture the business. That's the rationalization. If we don't do it, someone else will. It's the same logic used by every merchant of misery in history. And technically it was true. If the Sassoons had stopped, Jardine Matheson or Denton Company would have expanded to fill the gap. But that doesn't make it less evil. It just makes it systemic evil instead of individual evil. The network the Sassoons built lasted for decades. It survived government crackdowns. It survived the fall of the Qing Dynasty. It survived changes in British policy. It survived international criticism. It was too profitable, too embedded, too protected to be stopped by anything short of revolutionary change. And that's exactly what eventually stopped it: the Communist Revolution of 1949. When Mao's forces took Shanghai, one of their first actions was executing opium dealers. Not arresting them, executing them publicly, as warnings. The Sassoon network, the warehouses, the compradors, the triads, the dens, was systematically destroyed. The people who'd profited from it were killed or imprisoned. The infrastructure was burned. Within months, the distribution system that had operated for over a century was completely eliminated. But the Sassoons themselves, they'd already left, moved their wealth elsewhere. The network was destroyed, but its architects escaped with their fortunes intact. And that might be the most damning part of the entire story. The system that ruined millions was dismantled. But the people who built and profited from that system lived wealthy, comfortable lives and died peacefully in their beds. Justice, it seems, was never part of the equation. Chapter 9. Japanese invasion. By 1947, Shanghai was experiencing a strange renaissance. The war was over. The Japanese were gone. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government controlled the city. Foreign businesses were returning. The Cathay Hotel was booming. Real estate prices were recovering. Victor Sassoon was hosting parties again, racing horses, living like the war had been just a temporary inconvenience. But underneath the glamorous surface, China was collapsing. The nationalist government was catastrophically corrupt. Inflation was spiraling out of control. The Chinese currency had become worthless. Prices doubled every few days. People carried money in wheelbarrows. A meal that cost 100 yuan in the morning might cost 500 yuan by evening. The economy was imploding, and in the countryside the communists were winning. Mao Zedong's forces controlled vast rural areas. They were advancing toward Shanghai. Everyone knew a confrontation was coming. The question was when. Victor watched all this with growing alarm. He'd survived the Japanese occupation by transferring assets overseas and waiting it out. But this was different. The communists weren't just occupiers. They were revolutionaries who believed in seizing foreign property, eliminating private ownership, destroying the entire system that had made the Sassoons wealthy. In early 1948, Victor made his decision. He would leave Shanghai permanently. Look, this wasn't easy. Shanghai wasn't just where he did business, it was his home. He'd spent over 2 decades building the most spectacular real estate empire in Asia. The Cathay Hotel was his masterpiece. Yves Ranch, his beloved estate, held championship horses worth millions. Walking away meant abandoning everything, but Victor was a realist. He understood that no amount of wealth or connections could protect him if the communists took Shanghai. Unlike the Japanese, who had occupied but ultimately left, the communists would nationalize everything. There would be no negotiation, no compensation, just confiscation. So he started liquidating, quietly, selling properties to Chinese buyers who still believed Chiang Kai-shek would win, converting assets to gold, to currency, to securities that could be moved. He sold his horses, a personal agony. He closed accounts, fired staff, dismantled piece by piece the empire his family had spent a century building. Other foreign businessmen thought he was panicking. They believed the nationalists would hold Shanghai. That American support would save Chiang Kai-shek. That communism couldn't possibly win in China. Victor knew better. He'd seen empires fall. He understood that history was turning against foreign privilege in China. In late 1948, Victor boarded a ship in Shanghai harbor bound for Bombay. He was 67 years old in declining health, walking with his cane. He took a final look at the Bund, the waterfront he'd dominated for decades. The Cathay Hotel, Sassoon House, the buildings bearing his family's name, he never returned. The communist forces took Shanghai in May 1949. The ease of their victory shocked everyone. Chiang Kai-shek's armies simply collapsed. Nationalist officials fled to Taiwan. The foreign concessions ceased to exist. The international settlement, the French concession, the legal fiction that had protected foreign business for a century, vanished overnight. The new communist government immediately began nationalizing foreign assets. The Cathay Hotel was seized and renamed the Peace Hotel. Sassoon House became government offices. Every Sassoon property in Shanghai, the apartments, the warehouses, the factories, was confiscated without compensation. The Sassoon Empire in China, built over 117 years, ceased to exist in a matter of weeks. But here's the thing. Victor had gotten out with most of his wealth intact. The properties were gone, but he'd converted millions into movable assets before leaving. The family fortune in India remained untouched. The investments in London were safe. He'd lost perhaps 40% of his total wealth, a devastating blow, but not total destruction. Other foreign businessmen who stayed, who believed they could negotiate with the communists, lost everything. Many died in Chinese prisons. Their families were left destitute. Victor's willingness to cut his losses and run had saved him. He settled in the Bahamas, a tax haven where he could live out his remaining years in luxury. He bought a penthouse, maintained a yacht, still threw parties, though smaller ones, still raced horses, though the Shanghai Race Club was gone, but Shanghai haunted him. In interviews during the 1950s, Victor would talk about the city obsessively, about the Cathay Hotel, about the Bund, about the golden age before the wars. Friends said he never really recovered from losing Shanghai. It had been his greatest achievement, and watching it slip away broke something in him. The broader Sassoon family had different reactions. The Indian branches, the relatives who'd stayed in Bombay and Calcutta, weathered the changes better. India gained independence in 1947, but the new government allowed existing businesses to continue operating. The Sassoon mills, the trading houses, the real estate in India remained profitable. However, India's new socialist government imposed heavy restrictions. Wealth taxes, import controls, regulations that made the freewheeling capitalism of the British era impossible. The Sassoons couldn't operate the way they had for generations. Slowly, they started moving operations to Britain. By the mid-1950s, most of the family had relocated to London. They maintained business interests in India, but were no longer based there. The Sassoon mills were sold to Indian industrialists. The Bombay properties were liquidated. The family that had dominated Indian trade for 120 years was exiting. Victor died in 1961 in the Bahamas. His estate was valued at approximately $100 million, roughly $1 billion today. Substantial, but nowhere near what it would have been if Shanghai had remained open to foreign business. His obituary in the Times of London called him the last of the great merchant princes. The era he represented, of families controlling entire trade networks, operating across empires, answering to no government, was over. The Sassoon name faded remarkably quickly. Within a generation, most people had forgotten them. The Opium Empire, the Shanghai domination, the century of enormous wealth and influence, all of it slipped into historical obscurity. Today, the Peace Hotel still stands on the Bund in Shanghai. Tourists stay there without knowing it was once the Cathay, built by Victor Sassoon with opium profits. The David Sassoon Library still operates in Mumbai. A few streets in Bombay still bear the Sassoon name. But the family, scattered, assimilated, gone. What remains is a historical question. How should we remember the Sassoons?